Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 5, which is all about Russia and the near abroad. So this is the second region we're going to cover in this class. Right now we're looking at St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, which is on the Red Square. And so what do we mean by the near abroad? Most of us know what we mean by Russia. It is the Russian term for other Soviet socialist republics. So we're looking at areas that were formerly part of the USSR before its collapse. It's grouped together because they still have very strong relationships with one another from this time when they were all part of the same country. This excludes the Baltic states, which are considered more European, and so we talked about those in Europe. We talk about the physical landscape of the region. It is mostly flat. You can see giant plateaus across the area as well as plains. There are mountain ranges on the southern edge that really form a strong cultural boundary between Russia and the rest of Asia. It has an extraordinarily long coastline, just like Europe does, except one of the big differences, it is mostly frozen. So the ice-free ports are very important in the region because the vast majority of the north is completely frozen. It also includes the Caspian Sea, which is the world's largest lake. It is a salty lake. It is in something called an endorheic basin, so water flows into it but not out of it, so it'll continue to get salty over time. And many long rivers, but most of them flow into that Caspian Sea, which is a closed body of water, or to the Arctic. So this region did not have that benefits of trade and shipping that Europe did. When we talk about the climate of Russia, it's at a high latitude, but it is colder than Europe. There are huge swings in temperature in those inland areas due to that continentality, and we can see how it compares to the US on the right there. Right, Russia is more on the level of latitude with Canada. Um, Huge temperature fluxes, though, in Yakutsk, where that Y is on the left. The record high is 101 and the record low is minus 84, quite a temperature range. The southwestern or coastal areas by the Black Caspian Sea are much warmer. And they have several deserts and steppes, which a steppe is just something that is slightly wetter than a desert in the stands, which we'll talk about. And then we also have frozen tundra in Siberia. And then there's kind of one humid belt in between, which runs right there. So that regional connection, we're going to talk about the USSR and what it was and how important it was for the kind of formation of that region. So in 1917, there was a Bolshevik or peasant revolt against the bourgeoisie or the landowners and the monarchy. And from that, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics arose, from that and from the spread of communism. And throughout that time, there was this idea of Russification. And so this spreading of cultural Russianness, right? We all are Russian. We want to speak Russian. We want to be Russian. And everything we do is for Mother Russia. And so there was a big attempt to unify the culture of the USSR, that everybody was just kind of this blanket Russian. It was a totalitarian government. So they controlled everything from aspects of private life to all aspects of the economy. They heavily invested in their military, and so this led to kind of ineffective industrialization. And so they were economically behind Europe due to this heavy investment in the military and not in the people and the economy. I just want to take a minute to go over some political and economic systems, some terms. These are really relevant for any of the regions that we cover, but I use these words a lot, and I want to make sure that we all know what they mean. So the first one is authoritarianism, and this is where a large amount of authority is invested in the state at the expense of personal freedom. So this definitely applied under the USSR. The next is an autocracy where all the power rests with a single ruler. So we can think about North Korea as an example there. Communism, which was also the case with the USSR, is where the economy, capital, property, and public services are controlled by the state. And so the goal of communism, which failed under the USSR, was to have a classless society. The next is fascism, which is a nationalistic, authoritarian, anti-communist movement based upon racial identity, where the nation is the state. So we can think about Nazi Germany being a fascist regime, where it was all about the Aryan race and that they were kind of the true citizens of Germany. A theocracy is a state or government that is run by priests or clergy. So we can think about Iran as an example of this. Totalitarianism, which is what I mentioned in the previous slide, is where the ruling authority extends its power over all aspects of society and regulates every aspect of life, which was certainly the case under the USSR. Next is capitalism, which capitalism often goes hand in hand with democracy, at least in discussion, but they are really two separate things. It is an economic system in which the means of production, such as land and factories, are privately owned and operated for profit. Um, Democracy is where all the people as a whole make decisions. The US is not really a true democracy. We are a republic. So the ultimate power resides in the people who elect representatives to participate in decision making on their behalf, right? We don't vote individually at everything. We elect members of the House and members of the Senate to kind of make some of these decisions for us. Socialism, which sometimes is talked hand in hand with communism, but it's a very different thing, is a socioeconomic system in which property and the distribution of wealth are subject to control by the workers. And so the goal there is equality. And again, all of these things kind of overlapped. If we in our country we have social security, that is a socialist program, right, where everybody is contributing to the system, and the idea is that when you retire, you get to benefit from that. So again, these concepts and schemes overlap all the time. Many states have aspects of several, and for example, socialism, democracy, and capitalism all exist in the United States. And so the USSR collapsed in the late 1990s. So those Soviet ideals were conformity, subjugation to the state, collectivism, but it led to some very not great economic outcomes. You can see here on the bottom right, people waiting in these really long bread lines just to simply buy bread because the state controlled all of the resources and there weren't enough of them. And so again, they invested in that military, not the people. And so the economy was really declining, and they tried to restructure their economy in the 1980s, which was unsuccessful. And so in 1991, it collapsed. And so there's this kind of a hangover from that state of the USSR. It splintered into independent states. Um, there's still heavy Russian influence in these independent states and Russian people because being Russian is also an ethnicity. So there are people, and we'll talk about the Ukraine and Crimea, who very much consider themselves Russian, but they aren't in Russia. Um, there's heavy Russian influence in business. Um, there's a lot of authoritarian governments that came to power afterwards. We can see this statue in Turkmenistan, where this one particular ruler just built a bunch of gold statues of himself rather than giving any wealth back to the people. And so we went from extractive communism, that idea where you're taking all the resources for the country and it's benefiting few, to this idea of extractive capitalism. So technically capitalist societies, but all of that wealth is just going to the elite or the rulers. After the USSR, we also got the country of Russia, which is the Russian Federation. It is the world's largest country. It is dominated by the Russian ethnic group, but not exclusively. There's quite a bit of ethnic diversity in Russia. And so this federation is a union of partially self-governing states. And you can think about that in terms of like the United States, right? We have 50 partially self-governing states. So it's like the USSA, each state has some of its own power, but really they don't have nearly as much power as they do in the US. Basically, it implies cultural freedom, not political or economic freedom. One of the lessons that Russia learned after the USSR was that trying to suppress people's culture and language and religion just led to civil unrest. So now the Russian government is allowing people to just speak their own language, have their own culture, practice their religion. And so you have plenty of non-Russian Russians who live in uh, in Russia. So you have this Tatar woman at the top, a Yakut couple in the Sakha Republic, Chechens, right? Lots of different ethnic groups that do not consider themselves ethnically Russian at all. We also have other states like Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. They are three very, very different countries, even though they were all formerly part of this USSR. Belarus is very, very, very Russian. The Ukraine has Russian influence, but don't call them Russian unless they are Russian, which there's a significant Russian population in the south, in Crimea, right there. And so Crimea recently was annexed by Russia, so still recognized as part of the Ukraine, but is currently under Russian control. And then you have a country like Moldova, which is very culturally Romanian, as it shares a border with Romania. And then you have the Caucasus region, where you have Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and also part of Russia. You have this very, very rugged terrain there, you can see in the top right, that has resulted in isolated and diverse cultures. There are lots of geopolitical issues there, lots of nationalist violence, lots of disputed areas. There's also potential Balkanization happening here. And remember, we learned that from Europe. It's that breaking apart into smaller countries. So there is a good chance that that will happen in the future. Then we have Central Asia, which are the stands. So Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And stan just means land. Uzbekistan just literally means land of the Uzbeks. They are culturally Turkic and Persian, so not Russian, and they are all majority Muslim countries, which is unique to this region. When we look at language in the region, remember, again, this was once one country, which is pretty incredible. So we have the Slavic languages, which include Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. And then we also have many, many different languages throughout Russia, and reminding now, like you are allowed to speak your own language, do business in your own language, right? These languages are more culturally protected. Um, so there are some vastly different languages in other Soviet socialist republics, and in many other Soviet socialist speaking republics. I'm sorry, Russian speaking. Ugh, I'm going to start that sentence over. In many of these former Soviet socialist republics, you have Russian speaking minorities, such as in the Ukraine. You're going to watch a video, which won't be linked here, but you're going to watch a video that shows kind of a big dispute in the Ukrainian parliament between people who wanted to also make Russian an official language of the Ukraine. But for some people, that's such a hot button issue because they think about it being under control of Russia, and an actual fistfight broke out in the middle of parliament. And so again, you can see here, you have this very large portion of Russian speakers in southern Ukraine who consider themselves definitely more Russian, and this area was recently annexed by Russia. Religion in the region is mostly Eastern Orthodox Christian. There are several national churches. We have Islam in Central Asia and Azerbaijan. And that religion was suppressed under communism, but it is not anymore for those reasons that I previously mentioned. So there's been a renaissance of religion since. And Russian leadership, we can see here, Vladimir Putin, who is the leader of Russia, is very much allied with the church there. And so, but there is still this very strong sense of Russian nationalism and Russian identity, right? We are doing things for Mother Russia. It is a big part of the national psyche here. Very often, when the West kind of reprimands Vladimir Putin, people who live in Russia actually really like that. They take pride in the fact of their Russianness. And this includes language and the church, right? Having this common religion, but also so many people speaking the Russian language. There is a lot of push in Russia to expand their borders, such as what happened with Crimea, because they feel like there are parts that should belong to Russia that do not, and definitely this strong defense of the empire. Um, so there's a lot of tensions in the near abroad because of this. Several states are almost like puppet states of Russia, while other ones are strongly pushing back against them. And so in places like Kazakhstan, where you have a 39% ethnic Russian population, there can be a lot of civil unrest because of that. We had a civil war in Ukraine because of Crimea. And then also, Russia is aligned with the Assad regime in Syria, and that has caused several tensions in the international community. Most Western nations want Assad to step down and to stop fighting his people. Russia is aligned with them and, often rationalizes it as well, their real fight is against ISIS, which we'll talk about a lot more when we get to the Middle East. Um, but this idea of Russian nationalism and identity is very politically popular in Russia. And so again, the conflict in Ukraine, just to give a good example of that, the Ukraine is 18% ethnic Russian. And so there's this question, is the country aligning with the EU, the European Union, or more with Russia economically? And so a pro-Russian president was ousted after riots and protests in 2014. You can see pictures of protests in Kiev, and then ethnic Russians burning a Ukrainian flag on the bottom. And so this kind of sparked Russian involvement um, due to this fear of Ukrainian nationalism that Russians were going to be oppressed in Ukraine. And also, Russia had a great desire for more influence in the region, so they seized Crimea. If you ask Russians what happened there, they will say that there was just an uprising and that those people asked them to come in. But the international community really believes that Russia meddled too much in Crimea. And so there was a war between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists in the east. Oops, excuse me. And so this conflict has kind of it will escalate a little bit and then calm back down, and then escalate a little bit and then calm back down. So that's the end of part 1 of chapter 5, and we will continue on to part 2 of chapter 5.